Hello, everyone. We are Val.
Ilse and Flor.
And for today's episode of this podcast, we're going to analyze the shows of Griselda and the iconic Da Sopranos. As you might know, Tony Soprano was a mob boss who projected power and ambition. Similarly, Griselda Blanco was the most impactful woman in the narco traffic field, where she was even feared by the biggest narco trafficker, Pablo Escobar. We found that in the series, both of these characters share similar traits of family-oriented, same-time period in America, and both are immigrants immersed in illegal worlds. So we wanted to compare what the two shows represented and how much influence The Sopranos had over the construction of Griselda.
The series tries to sugarcoat a woman who was bitter, evil, and vengeful. She had few emotions and a dark side within her that came to light during her years as the Black Widow, as they called her. However, in presenting Griselda's personality, family-orientated values are portrayed in order to create a positive reception in the audiences. In contrast, Tony Soprano was shown as an evil, powerful figure, without the need to emphasize positive traits, as male violence is often portrayed without requiring balance. Consequently, in evaluating how anti-heroes are formed and characterized, we want to explore whether the construction of their personalities and the positive traits attributed to these anti-heroes to connect with the audience are gender-based.
To further explore this topic, we wanted to speak with a specialist. Maria Luisa Ruiz is currently a professor in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at St. Mary's College of California. She also directs the Institute for Latino and Latin American Studies and serves on the Faculty Advisory Board of the Women's and Gender Studies program. Moreover, she has written an article that is relevant to the topic we are discussing today in this chapter of the podcast. Uneasy Lies, The Head That Wears a Crown, Narco Queens, Beauty Queens, and Melodrama in Narco Narratives. In the article, What Netflix Griselda Gets Wrong About Women in Organized Crime, in which she was interviewed, Maria Luisa stated that the motherhood aspect seems to be necessary in order to anchor this violent character in femininity, so that we can sort of accept the violence. This phrase truly resonated with our initial question about why was it easier to portray the man's dark side while hiding his good side, yet they were unable to depict the true evil of the woman, instead taking refuge in her role as a mother and especially as a woman, inspiring us to connect the primary source to address our questions. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with her today. Welcome, Maria Luisa.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Maria. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so glad we were able to connect for this really exciting project that you're working on.
Thank you. I'm here with my other two classmates.
Hi, I'm Elsa. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Elsa.
This is Flor.
Hi, Flor. Nice to meet you over the phone.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we just want to thank you for doing this interview with us. It really means a lot. So we appreciate your time to do this with us.
Of course.
We're going to start right away. So here are the questions.
So, how do you think the role of powerful women has evolved in media representation?
Okay, that's a good question. And I can answer it from a very narrow perspective specific to women in narco, right? The narco queens, of which Griselda is one, right? Because I think that's sort of what you're getting at. And a lot of my research is around the ways that specifically in popular culture, or pop culture tries to make sense of powerful women in these traditionally masculine spaces, right? Which is where Griselda really fits in, I think. And I'm not sure, because I've been thinking about this, and I'm let's see, how can I answer you? I'm not sure that there's really an evolution since I started my research necessarily. But I do think that in terms of the ways that women are talked about is the fact that there's a fictional reimagining and reinforcing and highlighting in that kind of about these women and the discomfort that pop culture still has with what is thought to be ruthless women who are successful in the narco trade, right? Mm-hmm. Because when you think about the ways that narcotraficantes, El Chapo, whoever the case may be, El Chapo is probably the most famous, Pablo Escobar, that the world is very hyper-masculine, right?
Yeah.
And the hyper-masculine qualities are kind of enveloped within a capitalist approach of rags to riches story, right? That's sort of the anti-hero piece that you're talking about. But that butts up against the ways that pop culture still views women via traditional tropes and traits, right? And these standards that women are held up to, right? So how do you reconcile ruthless violence with motherhood? How do you reconcile a woman drug smuggler with the traditional way that we think of women as self-sacrificing, for their la madre abnegada, right, for her entire family? How do you reconcile, again, these cold business decisions, right, with the idea of a dutiful wife and keeper of the home? And again, I think that this kind of dichotomy it makes sense in a black and white worldview, right? Where we say, well, these women are just taking on traits of men, right? It's a very binary way of thinking about the world, but we know that the reality and the truth are much messier and much more nuanced than that. And I'm not sure, we've had that conversation yet. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how I would answer you.
That's a great answer. Wow.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, that was so interesting to hear.
Yes, and also, taking this into consideration, do you think that the Netflix show of Griselda had an impact on the portrayal of Latin American women, or how media, or what needs to be changed in media to have, more accurate representations?
That's a really good question. Again, I've been thinking about a lot about this question, and I will start my answer this way. It is really, really hard to separate out the fact that it's Sofia Vergara playing Griselda. Okay. And I say this because of a couple of reasons. Vergara is probably the most recognizable Latina woman from Latin America in the entire U.S. because of her fame in Modern Family and her ability to hustle, right? She has commercials in both Spanish and English, and not just the most recognizable woman, but I think the most recognizable Latina with an accent. Yeah, right. I think there's a lot of Latinas that don't have an accent, right? So it's easy if they look a certain way to be kind of outside of Latinidad, right? Or whatever people think of in the U.S. context of what a Latina should look like or be, or whatever the case may be. So I begin my answer with that because I think what happens with the Netflix show, it is a jarring representation of Griselda, who, if you know what she looks like, and I'm not being unkind here, is nowhere near in terms of physical appearance to Sofia. And I know in some of the interviews, Sofia got, responded. She's like, oh no, I had a prosthetic. I did all of these things, but it was still Sofia Vergara, right? So I am not sure that the show did anything to change the way that U.S. And maybe I'm being slightly harsh here, simplifies Latino identities rather than reinforcing what people think women from Latin America look like, right? The sexy bombshell, the woman with the accent, the one who dresses in the tight clothes, all of those things, right? The Spitfire, the one who only operates via emotion rather than reason, which is sort of it's a very Western with a capital W, the rational versus the emotional. I'm not sure that show did anything to change perspectives, but rather reinforce what already exists in terms of ideas about Latina women in pop culture.
No, that's completely true.
Yes.
Changing a little bit, you mentioned before something about the anti-heroes, and in our investigation we have discussed the construction of anti-heroes, and we wanted to ask you, like, if you consider that there are differences between building empathy with a male anti-hero and a female one.
And again, I'm thinking much more within the context of narcocultura and the narratives of narco traffic, right? And I think that there's a glamorization that happens, and mythification that happens for anti-heroes writ large, regardless of if you're male identified or female identified, right? Because again, part of the research that I do looks at the intersection between melodrama, hero, anti-hero, and this larger cultural context of capitalism, right? And I really do think that especially the ways that narcotraficantes have been turned into anti-heroes is very much within the capitalist framework, right? From a U.S. perspective, right? The rags to riches story, the man who solito, right, with help from no one, he actually mows down his and kills his opponent. So he's the last man standing. You know, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, the ingenuity, the kind of working outside of systems. That is very, very much within the context of how we talk about capitalist success for legitimate business people in the U.S., businessmen specifically, right? The discomfort comes in when you're talking about somebody who's engaging in an illicit trade. And so we give it a sheen of respectability, right? ¿Cómo se llama? Pablo, no Pablo, el otro, Chapo Guzman. El Chapo was on the cover of Fortune magazine. Yeah. Talk about legitimizing in a U.S. corporate space, somebody who, he was on the cover because he was the billionaire. It was a billionaire issue, right? Talk about giving him a level of respectability. So again, I don't think that there's really a difference necessarily with the ways that male-identified and female-identified anti-heroes are talked about. I think what gets it to be more complex is what I said earlier about the cultural expectations of women generally in life, right? In culture and society. And then what happens when women try to invade these predominantly male, patriarchal, hierarchical, capitalist systems that are really, really unfriendly to anyone who's not traditionally white and male.
So right, and it's super interesting what you're telling us. We also wanted to tell you, to tell us a little bit about your article, the term narco queens, and how did you came up with it, and what made you wanted to write about it.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of articles, and then, the one that you read about Griselda was just an interview, and then I've done other things. So I will answer you this way, is that my interest really stems from watching telenovelas with both of my grandmothers and my aunts, right? Where I would sit down, watch Teresa, Ruby, Marimar, all of those, right? And there was something really fascinating about how those stories, I could go, to la casa de mi tía, la casa de mi abuela, con quien sea, and I'd be like, ¿viste la novela? And then we'd have something to talk about, right? And then I also found it very fascinating that my male relatives would be like, ay, esas novelas son de pura vieja. But then if you would ask them anything about the plot, they would know. Yeah. So they were watching it too, right? So there's something really fascinating to me about telenovelas and as a genre in terms of Mexican popular culture, but melodrama generally, right? There's something, and I'm not trying to say that there's something universal about melodrama, but there's something that is about that kind of flattened narrative style that I think speaks and resonates to a lot of different cultures. And I say this because in the 80s, there were a lot of Mexican telenovelas that were really popular in Eastern Europe and in ¿cómo se llama? In Russia, because of the storylines, right? Because they were easily understandable. They were kind of the Cinderella rags to riches. And then so that's the one piece of it. And then how I got involved in writing about narco queens, again, it's because I read La Reina del Sur by Reverte.
Yeah,
right, which is and for me that was like bringing together telenovela, melodrama with a narco queen. I'm like, this is the convergence of all the things that I've been thinking about in terms of gender, in terms of pop culture, in the ways that there's this level of discomfort with women in these traditionally male spaces. So that's sort of what began my interest. And, I'm still very engaged and interested in these issues about gender norms. I think it's fascinating that in Mexico there's now a female president, where in the U.S. we don't have one. So there's lots of ways to kind of adapt, I think, this work in this, going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was super interesting, everything that you told us. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated too.
It was really nice talking to you. Thank you for doing this.
Well, I look forward to seeing how your project evolves. It sounds like I said that you're very thoughtful with your questions and that you've done a lot of research. So good for you.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you so
great.
much.
Thank you. Have a good
nice
day.
All right. Bye, chicas.
Bye. Gracias.
And with this interview, we have reached the end of our episode. We can now conclude with all the research conducted, the change in the way we view a series and the way we perceive reality is complicated. On screen, portraying realities such as the Italian mafia, the figure of a man with a deep inner world, or that of a highly powerful female drug trafficker can be challenging. We often get stuck in stereotypes. Not everyone is represented faithfully, and this can significantly impact the people and realities they represent in real life.
It is true that we have seen some progress, especially in the importance given to women on television. Now we can find roles like Griselda's, where an entire series revolves around her. Yes, there are still details, nuances, and a need for a bit more of reality and less of the fantastical stereotype roles. But a significant step has been taken. We just need to keep working in the same direction to achieve a television world where we can see reality without filters or prejudice.
As a final message, we want to thank all of you for supporting these spaces where more diverse voices are elevated and for being open to reflect on the real impact of certain creative decisions and media behaviors that perpetuate stereotypes and inequalities. Thanks for listening and see you in our next episode. Bye!